On nights when the rain fell especially hard, Eleanor liked to bake cinnamon rolls. There was something about the combination of warmth and sweetness and spice that seemed to push back against the darkness, to fill the bakery with a scent so comforting that it could ease almost any troubled heart. Tonight was such a night. The rain hammering against the windows with unusual intensity, and Eleanor moved toward her spice cabinet with quiet purpose. The cabinet had belonged to her grandmother, as so many things in the bakery had. It was made of dark walnut, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands, its brass hinges green with age, but still functioning perfectly after all these decades. The glass doors were slightly wavy, the old kind of glass that distorted things just enough to make them look dreamlike, magical, as if the spices within were treasures from some fairy tale rather than simple ingredients from the market. Eleanor opened the cabinet doors slowly, reverently, as she always did. The scent that greeted her was complex and layered, a perfume built from dozens of different spices accumulated over years of careful collecting. She breathed it in deeply, letting it fill her lungs, letting it carry her back to all the time she had stood in this exact spot, opening these same doors, preparing to create something warm and sweet. Inside, glass jars held treasures gathered from all over the world. Cinnamon from Ceylon, its bark curled into delicate scrolls the color of autumn leaves. Nutmeg from Grenada, whole nuts that she would grate fresh when the recipe called for them. Cardamom pods from India, green and fragrant, waiting to release their perfume. Vanilla beans from Madagascar, dark and glossy, each one worth its weight in silver. Each jar was labeled in her grandmother's careful handwriting, the ink faded now, but still legible after all these years. Eleanor traced the letters with her finger, feeling the slight indentation where the pen had pressed into the paper. Ceylon cinnamon, one label read, for the sweetest rolls. Another said simply, grandmother's nutmeg, with no further explanation needed. The rain continued its assault on the windows, the sound both fierce and somehow comforting. Eleanor had always loved storms like this, the way they wrapped the world in water and sound, creating a cocoon of isolation that felt less like loneliness and more like safety. Inside her bakery, with her spices before her and her grandmother's memory around her, she felt perfectly protected from whatever the night might bring. She reached for the cinnamon first, removing the glass stopper and bringing the jar close to her face. The scent hit her immediately, warm and sweet and slightly sharp, carrying with it a rush of memories so vivid she could almost see them. She was 6 years old again, standing on a stool beside her grandmother, watching those same hands that had labeled these jars mixing and kneading and shaving. She was 12, being trusted with the rolling pin for the first time, her grandmother's voice gentle and encouraging. She was 20, home from the city for a visit, helping in the bakery and realizing for the first time that this was where she truly belonged. Her grandmother believed that spices held memories, that they absorbed the experiences of everyone who touched them and released those experiences again when heated or mixed or baked. Eleanor thought it was just a pretty fancy when she was young, but now, standing before this cabinet on this rainy night, she was not so sure. The cinnamon did seem to hold something more than just flavor. It seemed to hold love and history and the accumulated wisdom of all the women who had used it before her. She set the cinnamon on the counter and returned to the cabinet for more. The brown sugar, dark and moist, smelling of molasses and earth. The butter, which she kept in a small cooler beside the cabinet, its wrapper printed on the name of the local dairy farm. The flour, which she would sift later, fine and white and soft as clouds. Each ingredient was a piece of the puzzle, a note in the symphony she was about to compose. Outside, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the windows, and Eleanor paused to listen. The sound was like a living thing, like some great creature moving through the night, testing the strength of walls and doors, looking for a way in. But the bakery held firm, as it had held firm through countless storms before, its old stones and sturdy timbers more than a match for any weather the sky could produce. Eleanor smiled and returned to her gathering. Tonight she would make her grandmother's cinnamon rolls. Tonight she would fill the bakery with the scent of memory and love. And tomorrow, when the villagers came for their morning bread, they would find something special waiting for them. Something that tasted not just of sugar and spice, but of comfort itself, of rainy nights made warm, of darkness turned to sweetness. The dough for cinnamon rolls was different from bread dough, softer and richer, enriched with eggs and butter and a touch of honey that made it almost cake-like in its tenderness. Eleanor had learned this distinction early, one of many lessons her grandmother had imparted during those long afternoons in the bakery kitchen. Bread feeds the body, her grandmother used to say, but cinnamon rolls feed the soul. You have to make them differently, with different intentions, different prayers mixed into the flour. She began with the milk, warming it gently on the stove until it reached that perfect temperature, warm but not hot, comfortable against her wrist like bath water for a baby. Into the warm milk went the yeast, those tiny granules that held such enormous potential, such transformative power. She added a pinch of sugar to feed them and watched as they began to wake, to foam, to release their particular yeasty perfume into the air. The eggs came next, 3 of them, their yolks the color of sunset, rich and golden from the chickens that lived in Mrs. Henderson's backyard at the edge of the village. Eleanor cracked each one with a single practiced motion, the shells falling away cleanly, the contents sliding into her mixing bowl like small, self-contained suns. She beat them gently with a fork, just enough to combine the whites and yolks, not enough to incorporate too much air. The butter had been sitting on the counter for an hour, softening to room temperature, becoming pliable and easy to work. Eleanor cut it into cubes and added it to the bowl, along with a generous drizzle of honey that fell from the spoon in a golden ribbon. The honey was local, too, from the bees that lived in the meadow beyond the village, and it tasted of wild flowers and clover and all the small, sweet things of summer. She added the flour gradually, cup by cup, watching the dough transform from a sticky, shaggy mass into something smooth and supple and alive. This was the part that required attention, that could not be rushed or measured precisely. Every batch of flour was slightly different, every egg a slightly different size, every day's humidity affecting how much liquid the dough would absorb. You had to feel your way through it, trusting your hands more than any recipe. Her grandmother had called this listening to the dough, and Eleanor had spent years learning to understand what it was saying. Too sticky meant more flour was needed. Too dry meant a splash of milk. Just right felt like a baby's cheek, soft and smooth and slightly warm, yielding under pressure but springing back with gentle resilience. The dough she was making now was beginning to speak to her, telling her it was almost ready, almost perfect, almost alive. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm now, neither increasing nor decreasing, simply falling with the patience of water that has all the time in the world. Eleanor found her kneading matching that rhythm. Push and fold and turn, push and fold and turn, her movements as natural as breathing, as automatic as her heartbeat. There was meditation in this work, a quieting of the busy mind, a focusing of attention on the simple physical reality of hands and dough and the ancient magic of transformation. She thought about her grandmother as she worked, remembering not specific moments, but a general feeling of warmth and safety and being loved. Her grandmother had been a quiet woman, not given to grand gestures or effusive praise, but her love had been as steady and reliable as the sunrise. It showed in the way she made sure Eleanor's favorite cookies were always in the jar, in the way she let Eleanor lick the spoon even though it wasn't hygienic, in the way she held space for a lonely child who needed somewhere to belong. The dough was ready now, smooth and elastic and warm under her palms. Eleanor shaped it into a ball and placed it in a large ceramic bowl, the same bowl her grandmother had used. Its glaze crackled with age, but its structure still sound. She covered it with a clean cloth and set it in the warm corner near the oven, where the gentle heat would encourage the yeast to do its work. Now came the waiting, that essential part of baking that could not be hurried or skipped. The dough would rise in its own time, doubling in size as millions of tiny yeast organisms consumed sugar and released carbon dioxide, creating the bubbles that would make the finished rolls light and airy. Eleanor moved to her rocking chair by the window and settled in, watching the rain and thinking of cinnamon, of memories of all the rainy nights she had spent in this exact spot. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around her, pushing back the darkness beyond the windows. In its glow, the bakery looked like something from a painting, all warm colors and soft shadows, the copper pots gleaming, the flour-dusted surfaces catching the light like snow. Eleanor let her eyes rest on familiar shapes, finding comfort in their unchanging presence, in the knowledge that some things remained constant even as the world outside changed and grew and sometimes lost its way. While the dough rose, Eleanor turned her attention to the filling, that sweet, spicy heart that would spiral through each roll like a thread of gold through fabric. She gathered her ingredients on the worn wooden counter, the softened butter, the dark brown sugar, the cinnamon she had taken from her grandmother's cabinet. These three simple things would combine to create something far greater than their sum, a filling so delicious it could make grown men weep with nostalgia. The butter went into a bowl first, a whole half-pound of it, rich and yellow and smelling of cream and pastures. Eleanor worked it with a wooden spoon, pressing and folding until it was completely soft, until it would spread easily without tearing the delicate dough. The sound of the spoon against the bowl was rhythmic and soothing, a gentle percussion that blended with the rain on the windows. The brown sugar came next, dark and moist and smelling of molasses. Eleanor measured it by feel rather than by cup, knowing from years of experience exactly how much sweetness the rolls needed. She added it to the butter in stages, creaming the two together until they formed a smooth paste the color of caramel, the color of autumn leaves, the color of things both sweet and slightly melancholy. And then the cinnamon. Eleanor opened the jar again and breathed in the scent, letting it transport her once more to those childhood afternoons when the world was simple and her grandmother's kitchen was the safest place on earth. She measured the cinnamon carefully, knowing that too much would make the filling bitter, too little would leave it bland. The balance had to be perfect, warm and sweet with just a hint of spice, like a whispered secret, like a gentle kiss. As she stirred the cinnamon into the butter and sugar, a memory surfaced, vivid and unexpected. She was 8 years old, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table, crying over some small heartbreak she could no longer remember. Her grandmother had said nothing, had simply placed a warm cinnamon roll in front of her and sat down across the table to wait. Eleanor remembered taking a bite, remembered the sweetness flooding her mouth, remembered her tears slowing and then stopping as comfort replaced sorrow. Food is a language, her grandmother had said when the crying stopped. Sometimes it says things we don't have words for. Sometimes it says, "I love you," when our mouths can't form the shape of it. Sometimes it says, "Everything will be all right," even when we're not sure that's true. She had reached across the table and taken Eleanor's small hand in her wrinkled one. "When you don't know what to say, make something sweet," The sweetness will speak for you." Eleanor smiled at the memory, stirring the filling until it was perfectly combined, perfectly smooth, perfectly fragrant with cinnamon and love. She set the bowl aside and went to check on the dough, lifting the cloth to peer beneath. It had risen beautifully, doubled in size, its surface smooth and taut like a full moon. The yeast had done its work, transforming simple ingredients into something light and alive. Eleanor punched the dough down gently, feeling the air escape beneath her fist, feeling the structure collapse and then begin to rebuild. This part always felt slightly violent to her, this necessary deflation, but she knew it served a purpose. It redistributed the yeast, developed the gluten further, prepared the dough for its second rise. Sometimes things had to be broken down before they could be built up stronger. The rain outside had gentled while she worked, shifting from its earlier intensity to a softer, steadier rhythm. Eleanor could hear it now as music rather than assault, a lullaby sung by the sky to the sleeping earth. She turned the dough out onto her floured surface and began to roll, the wooden pin moving back and forth with practiced ease, the dough stretching and thinning beneath its pressure. When the dough was rolled into a large rectangle, thin enough to be tender but thick enough to hold its shape, Eleanor spread the cinnamon filling over its surface. She used a spatula for this, working carefully to cover every inch, leaving only a narrow border at the far edge. The filling gleamed in the lamplight, brown and glossy and impossibly inviting, waiting to be rolled into spirals, waiting to become something beautiful. The scent of cinnamon filled the air now, mixing with the warm yeastiness of the dough, creating an aroma so delicious it was almost impossible to resist. Eleanor breathed it in deeply, filling her lungs with sweetness, feeling the scent work its way into her heart the way it always did, bringing peace and comfort and the certainty that everything would be all right. Her grandmother had been right. Sometimes sweetness spoke louder than words. Eleanor began to roll the dough from the long edge closest to her, using gentle pressure to keep the spiral tight without squeezing out the precious filling. This was the moment that required the most care, the most attention, the most trust in her hands to know what they were doing. Too loose and the rolls would fall apart in baking. Too tight and they would become dense and heavy, losing the lightness that made them special. She remembered her grandmother teaching her this technique, standing behind her with arms wrapped around, guiding her small hands through the motion. Roll with your whole body, her grandmother had said, not just your hands. Let your shoulders do the work. Let your heart set the pace. It had seemed like strange advice at the time, but now Eleanor understood. Good baking came from the whole self, not just the fingers. The dough rolled up smoothly, creating a long cylinder with the cinnamon filling spiraled inside like the growth rings of a tree. Eleanor sealed the edge with a gentle press of her fingers, then stepped back to admire her work. The roll was beautiful in its simplicity, a log of potential waiting to be divided into individual portions, each one a small package of sweetness and warmth. She used a length of thread to cut the rolls, another trick from her grandmother. The thread slid through the soft dough without crushing or compressing, leaving each roll perfectly shaped, its spiral clearly visible. One by one, she cut them and placed them in a large round baking pan, arranging them in a pattern that would allow them to rise together, touching at the edges, supporting each other as they grew. 12 rolls fit perfectly in the pan, each one nestled against its neighbors like members of a family gathered around a table. Eleanor covered them with a clean cloth and set the pan in her warm corner next to where the dough had risen earlier. The yeast was still active, still hungry, and it would cause the rolls to puff and expand over the next hour, preparing them for their final transformation in the oven. Now there was nothing to do but wait, and Eleanor had become good at waiting over the years. She returned to her rocking chair, settling into its familiar embrace, letting her eyes rest on the covered pan across the room. The cloth moved slightly as the rolls rose beneath it, a subtle sign of life, of growth, of the small miracles that happen in bakeries while the world slept. The rain had found a new rhythm now, a gentle patter that seemed almost conversational, as if the sky were whispering secrets to the earth below. Eleanor listened without trying to understand, letting the sound wash over her like water, like music, like a prayer spoken in a language older than words. The lamp flickered once, twice, then steadied, its flame dancing in some unfelt draft. She thought about all the cinnamon rolls she had made over the years, all the batches that had emerged from her oven golden and fragrant and perfect. She had made them for celebrations and for mourning, for ordinary Tuesday mornings and for the most special occasions. She had made them for new babies and for departing friends, for the first day of school and for the last day of summer. Each batch was different, yet each batch was the same, carrying the same love, the same recipe, the same promise of sweetness. Her grandmother had made cinnamon rolls on the night Eleanor's parents died. Eleanor was 12 years old, staying at the bakery while her parents drove to the city for some errand she no longer remembers. The call came after midnight, and her grandmother had simply hung up the phone, walked to the kitchen, and started making dough. Eleanor had watched from the doorway, not understanding yet, knowing only that something terrible had happened and that her grandmother was responding the only way she knew. They had eaten those cinnamon rolls together at dawn, sitting at the kitchen table, not speaking, just eating and crying and being together. It was the first time Eleanor understood what her grandmother meant about food being a language. Those rolls said, "I'm sorry, and I love you, and I'm here, and everything will be all right," even though nothing would ever quite be all right again. They said grief and comfort and the promise that life would continue, even when continuation seemed impossible. Eleanor wiped her eyes, surprised to find tears there. The memories that surfaced on nights like this were not always easy ones, but they were hers, part of who she was, woven into her like the cinnamon was woven into the dough. She arose from the chair and went to check on the rolls, lifting the cloth to see how much they had grown. They were beautiful, puffy and soft, their edges just beginning to touch. Soon they would be ready for the oven. The oven had been heating while the rolls rose, its great stone walls absorbing warmth until they radiated it back in steady, even waves. Eleanor checked the temperature with her hand, counting the seconds until the heat became uncomfortable, feeling for that perfect balance that would brown the tops without burning the bottoms. The oven was ready, patient and waiting, eager to perform its ancient alchemy. She slid the pan of rolls onto the center rack, positioning it carefully for even heat distribution. Through the small window in the oven door, she watched the rolls begin to respond to the warmth, their surfaces starting to stretch and shine, their edges beginning to brown. The transformation from dough to bread was always magical to her, no matter how many times she witnessed it, this mysterious process that turned raw ingredients into something nourishing and delicious. While the rolls baked, she prepared the frosting. Her grandmother's recipe called for cream cheese beaten with powdered sugar and a splash of vanilla, thin to pourable consistency with just a touch of heavy cream. The cream cheese was tangy and rich, the sugar smooth and sweet, the vanilla fragrant with the warmth of tropical islands and the patience of long curing. Together they formed a glaze that would drape over the warm rolls like a blanket of sweetness. The scent of baking cinnamon rolls filled the bakery now, pushing into every corner, seeping through every crack, surrounding Eleanor in a cloud of sweetness that was almost visible. She breathed it in and felt her shoulders relax, felt the last tension of the day release from her muscles. This was why she baked, she reminded herself, not for the money or the recognition, but for this feeling, this peace, this sense of creating something good in a world that sometimes forgot what goodness tasted like. The timer she had set dinged softly, and Eleanor moved to the oven. She opened the door and was greeted with a wave of heat and fragrance, the rolls risen and golden and absolutely perfect. Their tops were burnished brown where the butter and sugar had caramelized, their edges slightly darker where they had pressed against the pan. They looked like small treasures, like edible sunshine, like everything good and comforting in the world made visible. She lifted the pan from the oven with thick cloth mitts and set it on the cooling rack by the window. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist now, barely more than moisture in the air, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. The night was ending, as all nights ended, and soon the village would awake to a new day, a fresh start, a morning that smelled impossibly wonderfully of cinnamon. Eleanor drizzled the cream cheese frosting over the warm rolls, watching it melt and pool in the crevices between them, coating each one in a shiny layer of sweetness. She worked slowly, deliberately, making patterns with the frosting that were as much for beauty as for taste. Each roll received its fair share, the white glaze contrasting beautifully with the golden brown tops, the whole pan looking like something from a dream of comfort. She lifted the pan from the oven with thick cloth mitts and set it on the cooling rack by the window. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist now, barely more than moisture in the air, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. The night was ending, as all nights ended, and soon the village would awake to a new day, a fresh start, a morning that smelled impossibly wonderfully of cinnamon. Eleanor drizzled the cream cheese frosting over the warm rolls, watching it melt and pool in the crevices between them, coating each one in a shining layer of sweetness. She worked slowly, deliberately, making patterns with the frosting that were as much for beauty as for taste. Each roll received its fair share, the white glaze contrasting beautifully with the golden brown tops, the whole pan looking like something from a dream of comfort. She pulled one roll from the edge of the pan, the smallest one, the one she always claimed for herself. It was warm in her hands, soft and yielding, the frosting coating her fingers with sweetness. She took a bite and closed her eyes, letting the flavors wash over her, the tender dough, the spiced filling, the tangy sweetness of the glaze. It was perfect. It was always perfect. Her grandmother's recipe had never failed her. Standing there by the window, eating her cinnamon roll and watching the rain-washed dawn arrive, Eleanor felt her grandmother's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside her. She could almost hear the old woman's voice, gentle and warm, saying the words she had said so many times before. "Well done, my dear, well done." And she could almost feel those wrinkled hands on her shoulders, offering comfort and approval and the kind of love that transcended death itself. The village was beginning to stir now, sounds of doors opening and voices calling, and the day beginning its slow unfurling. Soon Eleanor's customers would arise seeking their morning bread, and they would find these cinnamon rolls waiting for them, warm and fragrant and full of memories they didn't even know they were tasting. She would sell them all by noon, she knew. She always did. But for now, in these last quiet moments before dawn fully arrived, she simply stood and ate and remembered. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the world clean and fresh and new. The spice cabinet stood closed again, its treasures waiting for the next rainy night, the next batch of cinnamon rolls, the next opportunity to speak in the language of sweetness. And Eleanor smiled, content in the knowledge that some things never changed, that love could be baked into dough, that her grandmother was always with her, especially on nights like this when the rain fell and the cinnamon called and the old recipes came alive in her hands.